As many of you know, we have a seventh Unitarian Universalist principle. For any who have counted, it's number 7 out of 7. That doesn't make it any less important than the other 6, which calls for the safeguarding of the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I love those principles, but that one is a particularly fervently held one. From an early age, about the age of the children who were gathered in front this morning, I have been spellbound by the splendor of the natural world. I grew up in California, and I recall being in awe of the coastal redwoods. Some of them are about 1,500 years old, which is young compared to the sequoia further inland. It takes about 45 minutes to chop one down. These reach higher than the eye can see into a community of distant needles, and I was especially impressed at the sun slats that go through them, as tall as a skyscraper, that slice through these dark brown red trunks to the undergrowth. I ask in the world religions class that I'm privileged to teach at St. John's if there's anything the students can think of that they regard as sacred. For me, those redwoods are sacred. And do you know how many of the old growth coastal redwoods of this country remain? 2 to 3%. Some of them in the hands of logging companies. Small wonder that a woman decided to climb one and not come down for a little over a year. And I recall, as a small child, seeing the Sierra Nevada, where our co-op stores had a camp, the sapphire-colored mountain lakes like Florence and Fallen Leaf, and, of course, the spectacular cliff-edged coastline of California and Oregon later. Then I discovered there was a world beyond the West Coast, the sunset on the peaks of the Rockies as we flew over them, an Illinois cornfield at twilight with 1,000,000 fireflies like a cyclotron coming up out of the earth. And of all places, I saw beauty in Texas, the bluebonnet wildflowers of March creating lakes of indigo, the roaring whitewaters of Gooseberry Falls in Minnesota. And most inspiring for me, and it really relates to what's happening today, this beautiful November day, in the Adirondacks on October 4th, which was famed for its cloudy weather. There wasn't one cloud. Every hillside was radiating with brilliant oranges and ochres and reds and golds, each slope different, each one magnificent. So, the verdict is in. We have a beautiful land, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. And then there is the world beyond this beautiful land, much of which I have not seen, much of which many of us have not seen. I met somebody who'd been to 55 countries last week. That's more than I have. A little more even than my mother has. She only went to 40. Like the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, which is apparently indescribably magnificent, and the Amazon jungle, with more species of plants and animals than the Atlantic Ocean. Early in my life, I also learned that everything, including ourselves, could be eliminated in a matter of a few hours with an atomic war, and of course, that remains an apocalyptic possibility. And there was the concern mentioned by one of the children this morning, brought to the world's attention dramatically by Rachel Carson and her philosophical descendants, namely the elimination of species and animals and environments due to pesticides and pollution or excess killings by human beings. How rejuvenating it was last summer when Andrea and I were on a boat off Hawaii to learn that 2,500 to 3,000 humpback whales also visit Hawaii from Alaska. They were almost wiped out. And the 1987 ban on commercial whaling kicked in. And they make a yearly commute. We are now confronting a third overwhelming threat to our interdependent web of all existence, and that has far-reaching and potentially irreversible consequences. I am speaking, of course, of climate change. Or to be more specific, as scientists have known for a while, the planet is warming at an alarming rate, which is potentially calamitous for human beings and other living things. And that warming is caused, say the same scientists, by human activity. That proposition is not infrequently doubted and challenged. Some of the more vociferous challengers are members of the United States Congress, who then follow their definite opinions by saying, well, I'm not a scientist. But there is no longer any dispute in the scientific community, those who are involved with peer-reviewed scientific research about the existence of climate change caused by human beings. 97% of the world's climate scientists accept human-spawned climate change as an overwhelmingly verified fact, not a conjecture. It is fair to say that global warming may be the most carefully and fully studied topic in human history, said Ralph Cicerone, president of the National Academy of Sciences. So why then do some 90% of the American public feel shaky, quote unquote, uncertain about the particulars of climate change? Why are even many of those who believe that dangerous global warming may be occurring unable to articulate the reasons for their beliefs? And until recently, I count myself one of them. Various scientists have an answer for that. They are the first to admit that scientists are notoriously unsuccessful at communicating their findings to the general public on a whole array of matters, not just this one. With the exception of rare people like the late Carl Sagan and Bill Nye, scientists have tended to feel most comfortable speaking to other scientists, often with terminology and complex formulas that the vast majority of the public find incomprehensible. And yet, scientists are getting to be the first to admit that there are certain scientific issues the public must understand. George Clemenceau was twice the Prime Minister of France, once remarked that war is too important a matter to be left up to the generals. So science is too important a matter sometimes to be left up only to scientists. When, for example, the Great Plague of Europe invaded the population in the 1300s, the greatest killer in European history, took the lives of 50 to 100 million people. In some communities, cats were thought to be the culprit, the cause of the plague. So campaigns to kill cats deprived people of the one animal that could conceivably have saved their lives. We now know that a microorganism carried in rats was the source of the plague. Sometimes ignorance is emphatically not bliss. And I believe the issue of climate change is a religious issue. I've already mentioned our own principle, the interdependent web. But also Unitarians and Universalists have always embraced the profoundly important insights that have come from scientific research and discovery. Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, was a Unitarian minister. In fact, he founded the first Unitarian church not very far from here in Northumberland and then Philadelphia. Unitarians were the first religious denomination to embrace Darwinian evolution. Ours is a spirituality that doesn't require us to leave our minds at the doorstep. And second, many religious traditions, not just ours, at their finest moments, have recognized that an essential responsibility of religion is to warn humanity of dangers, especially ones of our own making, and most especially ones that we can prevent. We cannot allow, say, our greatest voices like Amos and Isaiah, humanity to run headlong over a cliff, and that includes a climate change cliff. So, that is why this book that I quoted this morning, what is the case for human-induced climate change, briefly? First, because the temperature of the Earth has warmed at a rate not encountered for thousands of years, the Earth can't help but be changed. Temperatures have been accurately and consistently recorded since the mid-1800s. And according to our records, 15 of the past 16 years rank as the warmest ever. Some of us may find that puzzling. There's still plenty of cold weather to be had. We just in the northeastern United States had a delightfully cool summer and an excruciatingly cold and severe winter last year. You might recall, or you might not want to recall, that we kept hearing this word polar vortex. And so why? If the Earth is warming, all of this winter weather. And the Union of Concerned Scientists have a quick answer. There is a difference between weather and climate. Weather is what happens year to year, day to day, hour to hour. Can be sunny and warm 1 hour and then a little later in the morning pouring rain. In fact, given climate change, some areas can be colder than they often have been in the past when polar air invades the southern regions. Climate, by contrast, is weather measured over a long period of time. Years, decades, centuries. And viewed that way, the Earth is unmistakably warming. The 10 hottest years on record were between 2000 and 2010. And every one of the past 35 years has been warmer than the 20th century average. Ice shelves and land ice that have been in place for hundreds of thousands of years are melting. Literally 40% of the Arctic ice has melted in 30 years. The Arctic, with its polar bears, are on tiny pieces of ice that we referred to earlier and we see on images, aren't the only places where this is being affected. The massive Chalcataya Glacier gave fresh water to the country of Bolivia. It's now gone. And the scientific community has an explanation for that warming. When fossil fuels are burned, as happens with cars, with power plants and factories, carbon dioxide notably, but other greenhouse gases too, form a blanket around the Earth. And carbon dioxide can stay in that blanket for many decades. 20% can be as long as 2,000 years. Okay, say the doubters, but haven't there always been major fluctuations in climate? We've had ice ages, we've had droughts, probably long, very hot period in our history without fossil fuel emissions. How can we be sure that today's warming is not the result of natural planetary and solar shifts? There's an answer to that query, too. Buried in the Arctic ice is something of a history of the Earth. In an ice core are trapped air bubbles, which give us a record of the air over hundreds of thousands of years. The air bubble for 1963 had a very high content of radioactive cesium. That's when atomic tests above ground were taking place. Air bubbles that are from the more recent times have shown a 1/3 increase in carbon dioxide from what they were a century and a half earlier and beyond. Well, how do we know that that carbon dioxide comes from fossil fuel burning? The scientific community has an answer to that too, and they say it's very much like a murder mystery. You look for fingerprints. Carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning has its own fingerprint, an isotope, and that makes it different from carbon from elsewhere. And we know there are more of those fossil fuel isotopes in the air than any time in the past 800,000 years. Ocean levels are rising. That's not the only problem for our waters from sea to shining sea. There's also the increasing acid content, which eats into coral reefs and plankton, the basis of the food chain. But, Diana already, more than enough ample scary evidence. What can we do about it? That's what the parable in the reading was about. The good news is that we can do plenty, each of us, as individuals, which does not involve freezing in the dark. There are simple but vitally significant steps each of us can take. I raised this question in another context last spring when I was here. How many people concerned about climate change does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is 1. But it has to be a light-emitting diode light bulb. This is the sacred light bulb. And the first person who asked me for it has it as a gift today. You know that this will save 75% of the electricity that the older incandescent bulb uses, and it's now emitting warm yellow light. That's the same as if you left turned that earlier light off 3 out of 4 days. This one could stay on before it catches up. Then there is the item I used this morning for the blessing of getting here, known as a car. And I don't know who is thinking about buying another car, but if you are, you may not find this a great news flash, but just to amplify on it, a Prius gets about 50 miles to the gallon. A GMC Yukon sports utility vehicle, 12 miles to the gallon. A pickup truck, about 9 miles to the gallon. You're saving literally 9 to 10 tons of carbon dioxide emission from going into the atmosphere by using a Prius. Or if you want to step down, a Toyota Corolla isn't so bad either, 29 on my car. So why also do we focus on getting as much more oil as possible, getting that XL Keystone pipeline from the dirty tar sands of Canada, when we hear so little about retrofitting our own buildings? Anthony Malkin reduced utility bills on a building by 40% in 2010. You know the building he retrofitted? The Empire State Building. There are pockets of real hope around the world, and that includes what has often been called the third world. Jakarta, Indonesia, with its buses-only corridor in the city, reduced carbon emission 120,000 tons a year. Mexico City, fascinating place but an icon for pollution, closing the Bordo Poniente landfill has reduced greenhouse gases 25%. Addis Ababa has opted for only low-carbon building designs. It is heartening to know that this global challenge is receiving a global response, and that it's not in the domain only of the exclusively economically privileged. So, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I too have a dream. It is a dream that this world can come to grips with its fossil fuel addiction, that we can move toward a renewable energy future, which is our only future. We shall overcome this crisis because we must overcome it. That was the cry of 350 million to 400 million people in New York City last September, including at least one member from this congregation. And it is a cry from the earth itself. I believe we have the wherewithal, the creativity, the competence to address this crisis of our own making. What we need is the will. Let us resolve, for our children's sake, and their children, and ourselves, to preserve, protect from global warming the interdependent web of all existence, a web of which we human beings are a part. Amen. And we will sing about the beauty of the earth, and then I understand the postlude is America the Beautiful. So if you would